Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Reverantelo. Today I'm going to talk about a very special address, which is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt Pearl Harbor Address and why it still matters. December 8, 1941, the Japanese launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, a day which will live in infamy. But it matters for much more than that. Since Roosevelt's address was not just famous because of that very moment, it was effective because it matched the moment perfectly, since he understood the fear, anger, and uncertainty of the country. He delivered the speech with such calm and authority that when a nation needed strength, he delivered it. Why it matters still? Because he stands as one of the clearest examples of effective public speaking. To understand this matter, we need to first understand the situation around it. As we know, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on American soil that devastated the U.S. Pacific fleets, destroying battleships like the USS Arizona, which exploded, and killing over 2,000 American sailors. At that point, the United States had not fully entered World War II, even though war had already been turning to Europe and Asia for many years. Americans were still hesitant about entering another global conflict since they were just coming out of a depression. So Roosevelt was speaking at a turning point. Maybe that turning point could have went out the other way in another universe. But in this case, the nation had no choice and had decided to go to war. That is what makes the context so powerful. Roosevelt gave this speech one day after the attack. There were no luxury or distance or reflections. The nation was wounded, angry, and waiting for an answer. So, Roosevelt, instead of explaining what happened, he gave direction when the nation needed it. It had turned shock into purpose. And Roosevelt did exactly that. One of the smartest things President Roosevelt did was to show that Pearl Harbor was not just one isolated strike. In the speech, he listed other Japanese attacks in the Pacific. That choice mattered because it framed the event not as some limited incident, but as a broader and coordinated military offensive. That gave the audience a much larger picture, since Roosevelt was telling the American people that this was not a misunderstanding and it was not a minor clash. This was war, already moving across the Pacific into American soil. By placing Pearl Harbor inside a bigger pattern of aggression, he prepared the country to accept the scale of the conflict ahead. Formally, he was addressing Congress. He opened by recognizing the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. But in reality, he was also speaking to the entire American public. Millions were listening in radio, in fact, and this became the first and only declaration of war ever heard by the majority of the Americans. That meant that Roosevelt had two jobs at once. First, he had to persuade Congress to declare war. And second, he had to unify the public and prepare them for sacrifice, hardship, and a prolonged conflict. And let's be honest, the public at that moment was not calm. Americans were angry, but they were also afraid. They did not know if more attacks were coming. Roosevelt had to answer that fear. So this speech was brief and direct, and it's a very important point. Since he did not flood the people with details that only military leaders needed or politicians, he did not over explain it. He gave the nation a clear moral thing. The United States of America was at peace, and Japan attacked deliberately. That clarity mattered because the people in crisis do not need confusion. They need something to hold firm in times of crisis. And the response proved that how well he read the room at that time. Congress overwhelmingly supported the declaration of war. Only the representative of Montana, Janity Rankin, voted against it. That level of support shows that Roosevelt did not speak to the nation, he connected with it. Now, for me, one of the strongest parts is the language he used. The most famous example is, of course, a day which will live in infamy. That line did not happen by accident, though. Roosevelt originally considered softer wording, but infamy gave the sentence for it. Since the original draft had world history, which sounded meek, vain, and flat, where infamy, on the other hand, sounds more potent, more moral. It sounds heavy. It tells the audience that this day was not just important, but shameful, violent, and unforgettable. That single word shows how carefully Roosevelt shaped the emotional power of the speech. He also used repetition to build urgency. Words like yesterday and last night reminded the audience that this was imminent and the danger was at the doorstep. He repeated the timeline because he wanted people to feel that this was not some distant event, that it had just happened. The wound was still fresh. Another thing that he chose was hard, forceful words like deliberate, premeditated, and unprovoked. Those words matter because they frame Japan's actions as intentional and aggressive. Roosevelt did not rely on fancy metaphors or dramatic imagery. He did not need to. The strength of the speech comes from plain language used with precision. Its structure is also simple, and that simplicity is part of its power. First, Roosevelt named the attacks. Then he explains Japan's deception, and then he expands the scale of the attack across the Pacific, and finally he speaks at Congress and asks them to declare war. That is a clean and effective way, with no wasted motion or vanity. Every part of the speech pushes towards action. And finally, we have to talk about the delivery. Roosevelt did not deliver the speech like a man losing control. He delivered it in a calm, steady, and commanding tone. That matters because if he sounded like a wild or emotional, he would have weakened the message. Instead, he sounded like a leader in command at a time of crisis. That calm delivery strengthened the credibility it told. But the government and its leadership was not collapsing despite it. To me, that is what makes his speech so effective. It does not waste time, it does not ramble, it does not change applause. Roosevelt gave the nation clarity when people were stunned and resolve when fear was spreading. He condemned the attack in unmistakable terms, but he never lost his discipline. This was important because real strength in public speaking is not just emotion, it's controlled emotion. Roosevelt did not sound theatrical, he sounded serious. And because of that, people believed in him. At its core, the speech had one goal: unite the country and secure imminent action. Not start a debate, not impress people with grand language, unite the nation and move forward. And it worked. Congress acted almost immediately. The American people mobilized. The United States entered the war. And that's the strongest proof possible that the speech succeeded. So in the end, FDR's Pearl Harbor address remains as one of the greatest examples of public speaking because it fits the moment, understands the audience, and uses powerful but descriptive language and was delivered with a calm authority. This turned the nation of pain into purpose. And that is exactly why the speech mattered. Thank you.